In the midst of World War II, on battlefields stretched across Europe and the Pacific, a single weapon earned the admiration of the men who carried it and the respect of the enemies who faced it. General George S. Patton, one of America's most legendary commanders, famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. That weapon was the M1 Garand rifle, a semi-automatic firearm that gave American soldiers a deadly edge in a war where fractions of a second often meant the difference between life and death. But what made this rifle so remarkable? Why did it terrify German soldiers? And how did it change the very nature of combat in the 20th century? To answer those questions, we must travel back to the 1930s, when the United States military was still recovering from the First World War, and the idea of mass-producing a semi-automatic rifle for every infantryman seemed like a fantasy. At the time, most armies around the world armed their soldiers with bolt-action rifles. These rifles were reliable, accurate, and powerful, but they shared a crippling limitation. Every single shot required the shooter to lift, pull, and push the bolt before firing again. In the chaos of combat, where an extra second could be fatal, this mechanical delay turned firefights into contests of patience and timing. Soldiers might fire a few well-aimed shots per minute, but beyond that, their speed was limited by the bolt. The Germans, the British, the Japanese all relied on bolt-action weapons as their standard arms. It was simply accepted as the way of war. But in the United States, a Canadian-born firearms designer named John Garand was quietly working on something revolutionary. At the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, Garand labored for years to perfect a design that would give every American soldier the power of semi-automatic fire. The ability to fire round after round with just to pull a trigger, no bolt manipulation required. By 1936, after endless trials, redesigns, and debates, his invention was officially adopted as a U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. Robust, dependable, and surprisingly easy to maintain in the field, the M1 Garand was fed by an 8-round and block clip that automatically ejected with sharp metallic ping once empty. For the men who carried it, this sound became as iconic as the weapon itself. At first, not everyone believed in the rifle. Critics within the Army argued it would be too complicated, too expensive, and too fragile for the harsh realities of war. But as production ramped up and soldiers began to train with it, opinions changed. The M1 Garand proved itself to be tough, efficient, and devastatingly effective. By the time the United States entered World War II, tens of thousands of these rifles were already in the hands of its fighting men. Imagine, then, what it meant when American soldiers carrying the M1 Garand first clashed with German troops equipped with their own standard rifles. The Carabiner 98K, a bolt-action weapon descended from the rifles of the First World War. The Germans were skilled marksmen, disciplined and aggressive, but they soon realized they were facing an opponent armed with something entirely different. Where a German rifleman might fire one aimed shot, work his bolt, and fire another, an American soldier with an M1 could fire 8 rounds in rapid succession, reloading in seconds, and laying down a storm of lead that made the battlefield feel suddenly lopsided. Veterans of those battles would later recall the fear in German eyes when they realized they were outgunned, outranged, and outpaced by this new weapon. But the significance of the M1 Garand wasn't just about rate of fire. It was about philosophy. The U.S. Army had chosen to arm every soldier, from the youngest recruit to the most battle-hardened veteran, with a weapon once thought too advanced for mass issue. Other armies saved semi-automatics or automatics for specialized troops, elite units, or officers. In the American military, every infantryman carried the M1. This democratization of firepower shifted the balance of infantry combat. It made squads of American soldiers far more formidable, capable of delivering continuous suppressive fire, breaking enemy charges, and holding positions against overwhelming odds. And it wasn't only the soldiers who noticed. Reports from the front lines began to filter back, telling stories of German and Japanese soldiers shocked by the sheer volume of fire an American squad could unleash. Axis propaganda occasionally tried to dismiss the Garand as a mechanical gimmick, but on the battlefield, its impact was undeniable. Even General Patton, a man not known for casual praise, recognized its importance immediately. For him, the Garand represented not just a weapon, but a symbol of American industrial might and ingenuity. It was fast, powerful, and reliable, qualities Patton demanded from his own soldiers. With the Garand in their hands, his men could push harder, fight longer, and break through defenses that might have held against slower-firing opponents. But let us pause here and consider the weight of what this meant. In the swirling chaos of World War II, where tanks thundered across fields, planes screamed overhead, and artillery shook the earth, the fate of nations often rested on the shoulders of infantrymen. Their rifles were more than tools. They were lifelines. To hold an M1 Garand was to carry a promise that you stood with an army willing to invest in giving you every advantage possible. The Germans soon came to dread this advantage. For all their tactical skill, their battlefield cunning, and their reliance on discipline, they could not ignore the sound of semi-automatic fire crackling from American lines. It was relentless, punishing, and demoralizing. The Kar 98K, for all its accuracy, simply could not keep pace. The very rhythm of combat changed when the M1 Garand entered the field. Firefights became faster, deadlier, more fluid. The bolt-action rifleman was now at a disadvantage, forced to endure the constant pressure of incoming fire without the ability to answer in kind. This, then, is where our story begins, with a rifle that reshaped the battlefield and gave American soldiers the power to dominate firefights. It is a story of innovation meeting necessity, of one man's design changing the destiny of millions. The M1 Garand was more than a weapon. It was a revolution, and its legacy would echo far beyond the war, in which it first proved itself. The Germans were outranged, outmatched, and outgunned. But the story of the Garand is not just about statistics or battlefield advantages. It is about the men who carried it, the battles they fought, and the fear inspired in their enemies. And as we dive deeper into this tale, we will uncover not just how the rifle worked, but how it won hearts, saved lives, and earned its place as Patton's greatest battle implement. When the United States entered the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the M1 Garand was already being carried by soldiers across the Pacific and soon across the battlefields of Europe. This was no small achievement. To equip an army of millions with a semi-automatic rifle required industrial dedication on a scale few nations could match. By the end of the war, over 4 million Garands had been produced. Every single rifle was a testament to American factories working day and night, and to a government that believed its soldiers deserved the best weapon technology of their era. As the war expanded, the Garand revealed its true power. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, Marines found themselves ambushed in thick vegetation by Japanese soldiers armed with Arisaka bolt-action rifles and light machine guns. The M1 gave them an edge in those sudden, close-range encounters where hesitation meant death. Veterans would later say that in those moments, being able to squeeze off round after round without working a bolt was the difference between living and never coming home. On the frozen plains of Europe, where American forces pushed back against entrenched German defenses, the Garand semi-automatic fire proved equally invaluable. German troops armed with the Kar 98K could fire accurately, but the process of chambering each round slowed their response time. Against an American squad, they were often forced to keep their heads down, pinned by a storm of shots, while their opponents maneuvered. This tactical advantage saved countless lives. But there was something else, something psychological, that the Garand brought to the fight. Soldiers often spoke of the confidence the rifle gave them. In foxholes, under artillery fire, or storming across open fields, the simple knowledge that you could fire again and again without breaking rhythm was empowering. It gave courage, and courage, multiplied across divisions, became momentum. Yet perhaps the most iconic aspect of the Garand was not its accuracy or its fire rate, but its sound. The sharp, ringing metallic ping that echoed when an empty clip was ejected became legendary. To American soldiers, it was a reassuring sign. The rifle had done its work, time to reload and continue. To their enemies, however, it was sometimes interpreted as vulnerability, a signal that the man firing was momentarily out of ammunition. Stories spread among veterans of German soldiers, waiting for the ping to rush an American position. Whether exaggerated or true, the sound became an unforgettable part of the weapon's identity, a kind of battlefield signature. Beyond its battlefield presence, the M1 Garand carried with it a sense of pride and American ingenuity. John Garand's design was not flawless. Soldiers sometimes complain about the weight, about the complexity of the gas system, or about the way the clip ejected. But overall, the rifle earned a reputation as a rugged, dependable companion. It worked in mud, in sand, in snow. It worked when it was abused and when it was maintained. This reliability was crucial in an age when a jammed weapon could spell disaster for a squad under fire. The Germans recognized this advantage. In fact, the Wehrmacht began issuing their own semi-automatic rifles during the war, such as the Gur 41 and later the Gur 43. These weapons were attempts to close the gap created by the Garand, but production never matched the scale of America's effort, and the rifles never reached the level of reliability or widespread use of the M1. By contrast, every American rifleman had one, from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin. And then came the stories, battles where the Garand made its presence undeniable. In Normandy, when American troops stormed the beaches under withering fire, the rapid crack of M1 rifles provided cover and confidence as men pushed forward. At Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, surrounded and outnumbered, American paratroopers fired their Garands in blistering volleys, holding back German assaults until relief arrived. In the Pacific, on Iwo Jima, Garands roared from black volcanic sand, hammering at Japanese bunkers. Over and over, this rifle proved not just to be a weapon, but a companion in the darkest moments. And then there was the man himself, General George S. Patton. Known for his uncompromising standards, his love of speed, aggression, and relentless attack, Patton was not easily impressed. But he called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. Coming from him, that was not empty praise. Patton understood the essence of warfare, that victory often depended on the morale and effectiveness of ordinary soldiers. If those soldiers carried a weapon that gave them an advantage, their will to fight increased. The Garand was a weapon of confidence, and confidence could carry an army across Europe. But to truly understand its place in history, we must look at what came before and what came after. Before the Garand, the bolt-action rifle was king. Firing one shot, working the bolt, firing another, that rhythm had defined the First World War, a war of trenches and attrition. The Garand shattered that rhythm. After the war, no military could ignore the lesson. Semi-automatic fire was no longer the privilege of the few. It had to become the standard. And so, the Garand set the stage for the weapons that followed. The M14, the M16, and the rifles carried today. Even outside the military, the Garand became a cultural symbol. Soldiers returning home carried stories of the rifle with them, stories passed to children and grandchildren. In time, the M1 Garand came to represent not just the Second World War, but the entire generation who fought it. Collectors would treasure them. Shooters would marvel at their craftsmanship, and historians would point to them as a turning point in modern warfare. And yet, despite all its power, the Garand was not a machine gun. It was not an unstoppable weapon of terror. It still required a steady hand, careful aim, and the courage of the man behind it. In the end, the Garand's greatness lay not only in its design, but in the partnership it formed with those who carried it. Together, man and rifle became a force strong enough to turn the tide of battles, and perhaps the war itself. There's a reason German veterans remember the sound of the Garand so vividly, a reason they described the Americans as having a firepower advantage that felt almost unfair. They were facing a weapon that, in skilled hands, seemed to bend the rules of combat. And in the desperate clashes of the 1940s, bending the rules could mean survival or total defeat. By the time the Allies marched into Berlin in 1945, the M1 Garand had earned its legend. It had fired in deserts and jungles, in snow and rain, on beaches and in city streets. It had been carried by a farm boy from Iowa, steel workers from Pennsylvania, and clerks from New York, ordinary men transformed into extraordinary warriors. And through it all, the rifle had delivered exactly what promised: speed, power, and reliability. This was not just a weapon. It was a revolution of steel and wood, of gas systems and end block clips. It was a rifle that symbolized America's determination to give its fighting men every advantage. And in doing so, it helped those men change the course of history. As the war thundered toward its climax, the M1 Garand was no longer just a tool of battle. It was a symbol of the American soldier's edge, the heartbeat of infantry combat across Europe, in the hedgerows of France, in the forests of the Ardennes, and in the ruins of German cities. Its distinctive crack echoed relentlessly, and in the Pacific, from Saipan to Okinawa, it accompanied Marines and soldiers as they fought through some of the most brutal combat of the entire war. The Germans, proud of their engineering traditions, were not blind to what they were facing. Reports from the front lines described the frustration of their soldiers. A squad of American infantry, armed with Garands, could lay down such heavy fire that German units often mistook them for having multiple machine guns. That misunderstanding wasn't entirely wrong. In effect, the Garand gave each soldier the firepower of 2 or 3 bolt-action riflemen, multiplied across entire divisions. It created a wall of lead that was nearly impossible to overcome. The Wehrmacht's response was telling. They rushed to field semi-automatic rifles of their own. The Gur 43, introduced later in the war, was a direct attempt to level the playing field. And yet, production shortages, mechanical issues, and the sheer pace of Allied advances meant that only a fraction of German soldiers ever held one. For the majority, the Kar 98K remained their lifeline, faithful but outdated. Against the Garand, it was a relic of an earlier age. But even as the Germans struggled to catch up, another weapon emerged. The Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle. Compact, automatic, firing an intermediate cartridge. It was a glimpse of the future. Yet by then, it was too little, too late. The Americans had already mastered a different kind of future, one that made their infantry a force to be reckoned with. And then came the battles that tested everything. At the Battle of the Bulge in the freezing winter of 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive, hoping to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. The fighting was desperate, savage, and punishing. American troops, often cut off and surrounded, clung to their positions with sheer grit and the relentless fire of their Garands. In places like Bastogne, the semi-automatic rifle became a lifeline. Surrounded by German tanks, artillery, and infantry, the Americans' ability to fire again and again without pause kept the enemy at bay. Soldiers who fought there later said that the Garand was not just a rifle, but a miracle of survival. In the Pacific, on islands where every inch of ground was soaked in blood, the Garand once again proved indispensable. Against Japanese defenders entrenched in bunkers and caves, the rifle's volume of fire allowed U.S. troops to suppress an advance, inch by inch, under conditions so harrowing that even veterans of Europe shuddered at the thought. On Iwo Jima, amid volcanic ash and fanatical resistance, the Garand's roar never stopped. It was there in the hands of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. It was there in the hands of soldiers charging pillboxes through withering fire. By 1945, its reputation was carved into history. The Germans had come to fear it. The Japanese had come to respect it. And the Americans had come to love it. The M1 Garand was more than Patton's praise. It was proof that sometimes the right weapon in the right hands can change the very rhythm of war. But what made it truly remarkable was not simply the engineering. It was a vision. In an age when most nations clung to tradition, America gambled on innovation, betting that giving every soldier a semi-automatic rifle would be worth the enormous cost and effort. That gamble paid off in the mud of Normandy, in the snow of the Ardennes, and in the sands of the Pacific. It paid off in the faces of men who lived because their rifles fired faster than enemies. It paid off in victory. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Garand story did not end. It would serve again in Korea, where American soldiers once more faced enemies armed with bolt-action rifles, and even Soviet-supplied automatics. There on frozen ridges and in desperate retreats, the Garand again showed its worth. It would even see service in Vietnam in the hands of allies, and in smaller conflicts across the world. Its echo lingered long after the Second World War was over. Collectors and historians today often marvel at its craftsmanship. Solid walnut stocks, steel receivers, the distinctive clip. To hold one is to hold a piece of history, heavy not only in weight, but in meaning. Each Garand carries the ghost of the men who once depended on it, their fear, their courage, their determination to see another sunrise. General Patton's words, "The greatest battle implement ever devised," were not idle. They were the summation of an era, a weapon that gave power to the ordinary man, that turned farmers, mechanics, and students into warriors capable of standing against the best-trained armies of their time. And though weapons have evolved, though today's rifles are lighter, faster, and more versatile, the Garand remains a milestone, a reminder when the battlefield shifted and history with it. Picture, for a moment, a soldier in 1944. He crouches behind a shattered wall in a ruined French village. Enemy fire rattles in the distance. His hands grip the wooden stock of his Garand, sweat mixing with dirt on his face. He knows the enemy has rifles too, but he also knows something else. He has the edge. His weapon can fire again and again, as fast as his finger can move. He can pin the enemy, suppress their fire, give his squad the chance to move. He breathes, steadies his aim, and pulls the trigger. The rifle cracks, recoils, and readies for the next shot. In that moment, the balance of power shifts, not because of luck, not because of chance, but because of design. That is the story of the M1 Garand, a rifle that outranged the Germans, that empowered the Americans, and that changed the way wars would be fought forever. It was not perfect. No weapon ever is. But in the crucible of World War II, it proved itself beyond doubt. It earned the respect of allies, the fear of enemies, and the eternal gratitude of the men who carried it. And so, as history looks back on that dark, desperate struggle, one truth remains clear. Sometimes the outcome of battles, even the destiny of nations, can rest on steel and with a single rifle. The M1 Garand was more than a tool of war. It was a turning point, a promise kept, and a legacy that endures.